This meeting is being recorded.
Hi everyone, and this is Ricky Spencer, and welcome to the Sociology of Media Voices series for 2023. Today we are very fortunate to have with us Senator Dorinda Cox. Senator Dorinda Cox is a Yamatji, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Noongar woman and an Australian Greens Senator for Western Australia, who has a strong record of working for social justice in her community. Senator Cox has extensive experience in domestic violence prevention, starting her career as a cadet with the Western Australian Police in 1994, and then going on to becoming an Aboriginal Police Liaison Officer, specialising in family violence and sexual assault. Senator Cox is especially passionate about being a strong advocate for First Nations people and violence prevention for First Nations women. And she had initiated the Murdered and Missing First Nations Women and Children's Inquiry in the Senate, which will soon begin hearings across the country. Well, welcome, Senator Cox, to our podcast series.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thank you. So can you tell us a little bit about what does social justice mean for you?
Social justice is an important issue in our communities, and particularly for First Nations communities across Australia. Social justice to me is essentially like a patchwork quilt. It's the fabric of our nation, and it is everything that reverberates across the community. So, sorry. Providing social justice is about providing human rights and enshrining human rights for First Nations people in particular, but it also extends to other people of, intersectional issues with that. So it could be LGBTIQ plus communities, people with disabilities, women, young people, people who are recently arrived or refugees or migrant background. So this extends to what is, social justice at the heart of the key issues that happen in our community, from issues of justice, housing, employment, equality as such. And all of these things are daily instances or examples of things that affect all of us. So when we have social justice operating in a way that it should, it essentially is like a well-oiled machine, and everybody's treated equally. Everyone has the same rights and responsibilities of being able to live in a just and free, equal society. And we all know that that's not how social justice plays itself out in Australia. And so we have a lot of work to do. And what essentially, the key components of that is the systemic oppressiveness and the discrimination and I'm going to say the R word, racism, that exists within our systems. And so it's up to us to uphold what I believe is a very key part of our both the contemporary part of Australia, but also the historical part of it. So when we talk about the journey or the legacy of colonisation in Australia, social justice plays a great part in that. So when did we go from a white Australia policy to being an inclusive nation? And when did we go from that to recognising First Peoples, First Nations people as the First Peoples of Australia? When did we go to making sure that we had disability inclusion plans that were included? These are all intertwined conversations and narratives, and in some regard you might refer to them as discourses that exist across both the Australian history but also into our contemporary society, that are important for us both to understand, to challenge, and to take on the biggest challenge in those is to make sure that we are stripping back parts of the social justice agenda to ensure that this agenda suits and is built fit for purpose for everybody.
Mm. And going on with what you've just mentioned about social justice, domestic violence is something that in recent years has become more and more sort of out in the table, where people are starting to look at more and really unpack. Can you sort of give us a little brief understanding as to what you see are the core issues that it's important for, I guess, people who are listening to these, students, teachers, parents? What do you want for people to kind of consider when we're looking at domestic violence, especially for First Nations women?
I think what we have to understand, Ricky, it's a really good question, is that domestic violence is essentially came to light as part of the Duluth model and the development of the Duluth model out of America. And what we understand is it'll take us 190 odd years to achieve gender equality in this world. And it's not going to be in my lifetime or yours, and probably not in my children's lifetime, that we'll achieve gender equality in order to think about preventing violence against women and our children, or women and our girls in particular. But going back from that, understanding at the macro level how violence is part of our history, right? Like, we were colonized through a very violent act. And here in Australia, that violence continues and perpetuates through systems. It continues and perpetuates through trauma, and the trauma that is intergenerational and transgenerational in its nature means that it continues to play itself out every day in our communities. And the way that it does that is through a thing called epigenetics. And epigenetics is the science in which we, through our DNA, do things that are a blood memory. That's what the Canadians refer to it as. So I do things every day in my life, which I'm not even conscious I'm doing, that are connected to my epigenetics and the history of my family. And my family are from the stolen generation. And so when my grandparents, grandparents, and my mother were all put into a mission, their way of life was structured in a particular way. It was orchestrated by the state, and it was governed through legislation. So violence became an accepted form through that process. So people react to violence in a particular way in my family, and they enact violence in a particular way. So these are all aspects or symptoms of trauma, and they are essentially what is the byproduct of what we've seen happen across the histories and generations within our families here in Australia. This is really present for First Nations people, people who've been displaced, people who've been disconnected, and people who have been taken away from kinship, kin, language, identity, and all of the things that have meaning and that essentially provide that platform of social justice for us to ensure we live our full potential and full lives with all of the things that are available to us. So at a very macro level, having colonisation be a violent act means that it has affected us as a collective. And when we think about us as individuals, what does that actually mean when we become the perpetrator or the victim in relation to family and domestic violence? Essentially, we've had a very white framing of that, and we've had a framing that it is believed to be happening within an intimate partner relationship only. But what we know through our research, and the research that I've done alongside many, many researchers, and particularly First Nations researchers, is it actually happens in all of our relationships, whether you are working alongside somebody, whether you are in an intimate partner relationship, a kinship relationship, community-based relationship, some of that violence is present. And so this is very, very pivotal in a conversation where we talk about communication, where we talk about our ability to resolve conflict, our ability to be emotionally regulated. These are all very important things that are trauma-based responses, our fight or flight, response that kicks in every situation that we're confronted with on a daily basis. So the impact for violence is a very personal one. And when I think about the importance of that is how we reframe this so that our communities understand and are able to articulate, and more so are able to heal from this. And so we have all of that baggage we bring from intergenerational trauma into our current lives. And that means when we're trying to raise our children and our grandchildren, we are utilising the positive aspects of that experience versus the trauma and the negative aspects of that we are passing on through the sludge in the bottom of the cup that we're all drinking from in the future, is the thing that we can tip down the drain and say, we don't want that anymore. And violence is a very significant part of that. And it's something we have to work at every single day in order to dispel the myth that all Black people are violent. We constantly hear perpetuated through the media, we are angry Black people, we are violent, we are criminals. And that is not the reflection of who Black people are in this country. And it's a really important conversation because in our law and culture, we had cultural protocols and tribal law and punishment that governed the what people would now see as offences or wrong way of doing in our community. And our old people governed all of that. What we had was that being stripped away from us. So we have to decolonise this space, and we have to get back to how do we reintroduce this alongside a justice system where people feel safe, people feel confident that if their safety is compromised, that they can rely on a justice system to provide that sense of safety. But we also are respecting and providing recognition and valuing and investing in our own cultural-based practices that are in line with our law, our tribal law from our country. And I think that that's an important conversation moving forward about how we can reinvigorate that. And I know that it is happening in different parts of the country already. And I don't want it to be some gammon version of justice reinvestment, because we're not de-investing in prisons in that process. We're still investing in them at a phenomenal rate. But we are not helping to resolve trauma of our men, of our women, and of our children in order for us to go on to the next generation with less of that intergenerational and transgenerational trauma.
That's very deep thoughts there. I want to sort of now take it to look at, with all your extensive experience in this space and your previous life in the police force, and you would have, as you just mentioned, that you've read a lot of reports and you've looked at a lot of ideas put forward for change. What do you see as the gaps that you have identified that if people are currently listening who are researching in the field of domestic violence and looking at ways that we can work more effectively, where would you like to see the focus be?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I'd like us to stop being researched. I think that we are the most over-researched people on the planet. And I think that I want to stop us from being under the microscope and behind the microscope to shifting behind the microscope. And I want to give data sovereignty back to the people. And I think that that's an important part of self-determination and mobilising a movement which puts us in the driver's seat of being the author of our own identity and our next discourse in this. And I think that one of the things I would like to see sketched out is that we use good allies as our current researchers to teach us and work with us on how we can be provided the tools to be able to do some of those things. And the reason I say that is because it's not like turning off a light switch when you're talking about the issues that happen in our community, that we've inherited these over 230 years ago, and we are not going to reach the end of those in the next 10 years even. And so longitudinal studies in the area of research are really important. And in order for you to do that, you need to have one, investment in that, and there are very few longitudinal studies, particularly in the area of family and domestic violence, that have been invested into to track the community's attitudes and to understand how that's evolved over a generation. And what I know is some of the things that that we did in my generation, we don't do in the next generation of my children. We're very much technology based now, and that we cannot rely on data sets that are not in real time also, that some of this needs some immediacy to be able to track some of the emerging trends that are happening quite quickly. And so real-time data is a really important aspect, particularly in the justice system and in both policing but also family violence. I think that if we empower grassroots organisations and people that are in campaigns and in peak bodies to really drive forward this what I perceive to be more of a data sovereign movement, we will, I think, get more traction in that. But we also need our allies to work beside us and to teach us and to walk with us in the journey that is going to be a long one. It's not going to be resolved overnight. So I would encourage people in your capacity as researchers to really think about what is my role, and in 5 years or 10 years time, how many people do I want to empower to be able to teach different methodologies and ways of collecting data in their community? How do I want to teach people the importance of qualitative data versus how many bums are on seats in programs? Because that's an important yarn, and the yarning aspect of our community is so important, and that you will get a 2-hour yarn from someone if you're able to develop a relationship, if you have cultural safety, if you are able to give them control of that data belonging to them and their community, versus it going to an institution or to the government. So I would encourage all of those things to be about your passion for people, your passion for inquiry. It's the reason I became a senator, because I had a lot of questions and I wanted to ask all those questions of the Parliament, and I continue to ask those questions. And I believe that the questions that I ask result in change. And if we share that passion in empowering people and inquiring in what I believe to be a change process, we will get the result that we seek, and that is about how we transfer the energy and the power to promoting those grassroots voices.
And I wanted to sort of, just before we wrap up, just to hear a little bit about the initiated Murder and Missing First Nations Women and Children inquiry that will soon be hearings across the country. Could you, or are you able to sort of give us a little bit of a synopsis on where that came from, why it's important for us to really take a deep sit back and listen?
Yeah, the inquiry came from a visit of mine to Canada in 2018, and I went to Canada on a research trip to the University of Calgary. And so I was in Canada talking about signs of survivance. And the signs of survivance is about 3 Commonwealth nations talking about the identity of gang violence and its shaping of an identity for First Nations people across Canada, New Zealand and Australia. And obviously that's a very new and emerging position in Australia, but one that is very present within particularly the justice system in Canada and New Zealand. During that visit, I visited Ottawa, and so I flew across the country, and I visited the Native Women's Association, who I'd met previous years in the UN forum in New York. And so I caught up with them and I talked through the inquiry that they triggered in Canada in relation to missing and murdered First Nations women and girls, and talked through the way that they triggered this inquiry and what some of the current findings were. And what I heard from them was that there were approximately 500 media articles over about a 4 or 5 year period of missing and murdered women and girls who essentially no one was looking for anymore. And some of the stories I heard during that visit were about women being stuffed into, laundry chutes in main city hotels. And, I could almost close my eyes and think about what was happening in my communities in Australia and some of the similarities of these stories. I was also fortunate enough to catch up with a friend who is the independent senator for Canada, Kim Pate, and talked to Kim about the work she'd done in the justice system and her relationship with the inquiry into missing and murdered women. And she strongly encouraged me to think about how I would do this in Australia. And I remember saying to Kim, if I ever got to the parliament like her, I would do the same thing and I would trigger an inquiry into what was happening to my women and children in Australia. I also visited the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and talked to them about their Vulnerable Peoples Unit, and the amount of excuses I heard about missing and murdered women and the horrific cases, but also things like the fundraising that communities were doing for boats. And I remember sitting there scratching my head going, what do you mean they're raising money for boats? And they said, well, they're raising money for boats because they needed to go into the rivers systems to look for their people. And I thought, wow, like we leave that responsibility to communities. And so when I came home, and it was another 4 years before I became a senator, I knew that in my first speech I would mention the fact that this is what I wanted to do, because it was already a discussion I'd had with Kim. And I talked with Senator Lydia Thorpe about this as well, and understanding that Lydia had also lost a cousin who had been murdered, and as I have as well. So our want for this inquiry to particularly look at the circumstances in which women are murdered and go missing, but also our children within the system that are almost invisible, that no one's looking for, meant that we had this drive to pursue finding out how many were actually missing, how many were actually being murdered. And we couldn't find any nationally harmonised data. So it was that was the first thing. So when we don't have the data, we don't have the numbers, we don't know what we're dealing with. So it was the first part of the terms of reference was making sure that we actually nationally harmonised our data. We needed to know which police forces were reporting them, what were the numbers, what were the circumstances, were they old, young, rural, remote, regional towns, cities, all of the things that disaggregated data could tell us as well. We also wanted to know what were the resources disparity which the police forces in Australia had divided up, in looking for women and children, First Nations women and children. That was different from white cases. And we knew this because the media reported on it differently. And so what is the role of the media? In white women's instances that are murdered, we have a vigil and, every night, and it's in the front page of the Australian, and, we have all of these memorials that are erected and spaces. But if it's a black woman, it virtually doesn't even penetrate the local media. let alone federal media. And there's no honour about her life. There's no respect for her life and the children's life and the way that we talk about them, in the way that the community have a sense of healing and peace, that these lives have been lost, but also that we are looking in a way of our homicide systems that work from monitoring to prevention. And these are really important factors, because we are going to end up killing a whole race of people if we don't stop and think about what the system is doing to enable this from continuing. And that includes deaths in custody, which is the state-sanctioned violence, which also is created amongst this inquiry. Intimate partners, children that go missing and who are in care. All of those things are relevant and important in this inquiry, and we want to hear the whole gamut pretty much. And so our hearings will commence at the end of next month, and we will be going on country to hear the first lot of families' voices, and we're encouraging people to put their hand up to be witnesses so that we can hear their stories.
We'll look forward to that really incredible, sad, but very important space. Now, for people who are listening to this, and they may be First Nations students in Western Australia and are sort of been inspired and feel, yeah, I want to do something. I want to become involved and help. And we know a lot of young women follow you and really respect the hard work that you do. Can they become involved? Like, if someone wants to say they're doing a TAFE course or university and they want to do some support and help out in your spaces, how can they, is there spaces for young First Nations people who want to perhaps put their hand up and become involved and help change the way we do things?
Absolutely. And joining the party is the first part of that, but there's also an opportunity, if you didn't want to join the party, to email my office or get in contact via my social media. And we are about to commence an intern program, both here but also in Parliament House in our Canberra Parliamentary Office, which I'm looking to take on a couple of interns. And also our volunteers. So there is volunteer capacity. That could be for a particular event. Now we have January 26th, Survival Day concert and Invasion Day rally coming up in a few days. We have many opportunities for the different campaigns, like the No New Coal and Gas one that's going to be coming up, understanding cost of living pressures for not just West Australians, but across Australia. And in my patch, probably one of the most under-resourced, portfolios I have is the area of science. And so we're always looking for scientists in particular, or people in trade. That's one of the other ones, or tourism. And the mining sector. Obviously, WA is a big mining, platform, and it's the engine room of the country in relation to economy base in the Pilbara. These are all really important portfolios that I hold, but there's no shortage of work here that you would be immersed in, and you could understand both the political but also some of the cultural aspects of the work that I do.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Dorinda Cox. We'll definitely put the links in there for any students who are keen or interested to reach out to you in your office. And again, to listen and really take a deep sort of reflection on the upcoming inquiry and see what we can do to help. Thank you so much for spending a bit of your time with us and telling us a little bit about the work you do and the important ways that we can move forward. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.